Okay, everyone, we've dealt with energy, all sorted. Let's move on to a related but distinct topic, sustainable transport and mobility, and how we're going to mobilize future modes of transport in India. Now, I'm delighted to have with us today a distinguished panel who will be able to shed some light, again, practitioners who are developing and rolling out solutions in this space, and people thinking about the systems approach and the financing of these. So I think I'll start with Ashish Singh, Climate Innovation Lead of the Shell Foundation. And then we've got Uday Khemka, who is Vice Chair of Sun Group. And we have then, along the panel, Somwa Parthasarathi, Director of Integrated City Planning and leader of India, Middle East and Africa for Arup. And then Ankush Agarwal, who's Chief Business Officer of Ola. Ankush, I'm going to start with you. You've got a hugely exciting business with a particular focus on the 3- and 2-wheeler sectors, I think. Tell me, what are the challenges in terms of both infrastructure, as you sort of roll out that, and the other sort of demand drivers in India for what you're doing, and what are the gaps to it happening even faster?
Sure. So, first of all, just to introduce Ola to everyone. So Ola is a mobility company based out of India, where our vision is to take electrification to humanity scale. So what we're doing is we are building electric products across 2-wheelers, 4-wheelers, from India for the world. And the technology is also very new, right? So India itself is, we sell around, not we, but India has a demand of around 20 million 2-wheelers in the country, and an additional of around 2 million cars sold in India every year. So for us, the biggest infrastructure play for us is energy, what you discussed in the last panel as well. So what we see ourselves as is fundamentally an energy company. And to enable the transition to electric, we need to be innovating on the key driver, which is going to be battery and cell. And so what we are doing at Ola is we are setting up a 100 gigawatt-hour plant in Krishnagiri, in Tamil Nadu. So in India, to take the entire mobility platform towards electric, you need 500 gigawatt-hour, and we will provide around 100 gigawatt-hour of that facility.
Very good. And what are there other sort of, there's a big supply chain you're building out there. And is there any other sort of, is there anything that if you could remove it that would allow you to go even faster? Is it capital, or is it anything else that sort of, is in the way?
So capital is obviously important, but the most important part is the technology itself.
Okay.
So for us, technology is a core enabler across the two of our businesses, products and services. So we have a ride-sharing business as well. Now, capital is a core enabler for the entire ecosystem. So for companies like Ola to succeed, we need capital not just for Ola itself, but across the ecosystem, like our suppliers, like battery technology companies, financing companies. The cost of an electric vehicle is slightly higher than that of a internal combustion engine vehicle, right? So when we look at how the industry needs to mature and invest in this as an ecosystem, we are looking at investments all across the domain, be it OEMs, be it suppliers, be it technology enablers. The entire ecosystem needs to grow together as one.
Great. Thinking about, taking that point about sort of ecosystem, Somya, you're kind of, we heard earlier about the massive scale of urbanization that's going to happen in India, and the need to sort of think about building a lot of things from scratch, but in some cases also elements of retrofitting. And I think the charging aspect of e-vehicles is clearly it's sort of partial new build, partial retrofit. How do you look at that sort of challenge of executing that challenge in a way that minimizes costs and sort of maximizes the ability to roll out new sustainable transport?
So, as a city planner, the way I see transport is it's absolutely a fundamental driver of quality of life in cities. And we heard earlier this morning that sustainable urbanism will be one of the big challenges. It's also the driver of economic development, and it butts up against pretty much every other systemic resource in a city, be it energy or economics or land use, you name it. I mean, interestingly, and you already said it, decarbonization of transport through electrification is important, but what it's going to do is put enormous strain on the energy capacity of the grid and in cities. I was just reading a study which says by 2050, probably 9% of all electricity demand will be EV vehicles. We've been doing some work in the UK and in Australia looking at exactly this issue. So if there was, for example, in the UK, 100% uptake of EVs, what would that mean for the grid? In some cases, you'd have to increase capacity by 20%. But that's not the only issue. It's not just an issue about increasing capacity, it's about demand management. So a lot of the interesting innovations that we've been looking at is, how do you charge? What are the right and optimal locations for charging infrastructure? Is it workplace charging? Is it delayed home charging, for example? And how do you take the peaks away? And in fact, in India, it'll be even more of an issue, particularly in summer months when that electricity has demand from data centers, from air conditioning and all of these things. So I think in order for the private sector to be able to roll out EV, whether it's two-wheelers or cars or public transport, I think working the energy system, optimizing that, not just putting capacity into the system, but looking at the right locations, the right sort of demand management is pretty critical. I have much more to say about transport, but on that matter, I'll pass it on to you.
Very good. One of the things my own company, Macquarie, has done in India is we secured a commitment of $200 million of concessional capital from the Green Climate Fund, and good, innovative, blended finance approach from the GCF of first loss equity that will allow us to raise more commercial capital and provide a leasing platform that will make the balance sheets of operators of buses and e-buses and four-wheel fleets and other sectors as well go further and hopefully just accelerate the rollout, and that's the sort of the rationale behind it. Maybe Shell Foundation's done a lot of great work, looking at where there might be gaps in achieving this rollout in a number of different sectors. But we're talking here about sustainable transport. Maybe particularly thinking about the retail side of this product, where it may well be, sort of individual self-employed people or private citizens who are looking to get a two or a three or a four-wheeler. What sort of gaps do you see in the market, and what are you sort of looking at doing to sort of plug them?
Yeah, that's a great segue. So if you mentioned about buses and larger infrastructure, if you look at the other side of the equation, like two-wheelers and three-wheelers, 84% of the EV market is, these smaller scale vehicles. And if you look at the segment of what we call urban transporters, there's a huge gap around the affordability. And compared to, let's say, the ICE vehicles equivalent, the TCO, total cost of ownership, is almost half for like two-wheelers and three-wheelers. In order to address the affordability challenge, we have been working with a number of NBFCs in India, non-banking financial corporations, specialized lenders, to create specific financing vehicles which can enable direct asset financing for these, let's say, urban transporters, and increase, in the end, our impact theory of changes, income uplift for them at least double. We have specifically been working with the likes of Revfin and Mufin to give examples, and we have created those vehicles where by now it's around 45,000 EVs that they have managed to finance through our sort of additional de-risking or guarantees that we have done on those vehicles. Well, I mean, the point I want to highlight more here is that that is absolutely not enough. The EV penetration is likely to go for these segments up to 25-30% by 2030. For that to happen, we need these kind of de-risking vehicles at much larger scale. When you look at things like securitization and other opportunities in more capital market-oriented vehicles, you need the EV as an asset class is not seen as mature. There's not enough data on the fleet right now. So our ambition and attempt is to take these kind of smaller scale de-risking vehicles. We are working with the local TFIs. We are working with a number of potentially other institutional players to see, can you take those, on one side, the need for asset financing and inventory financing for enterprises, and take it to the scale of capital markets through even like, you know, potentially green bond in the future, which is linked to it. So I'll pause there in terms of there are a number of challenges, but I think that's the key message I wanted to pass.
Thanks, Ashish. Uday, you've been involved in this sector, you know, as an investor in Sun Group for many years, and also through heavily engaged in the policy side of trying to move this sector forward through the Kempka Foundation. Where do you think that the private sector and, you know, having looked at both sides of that ecosystem, where the sort of partnerships are, and how best we can mobilize capital, you know, at greater scale into the sector?
Thank you so much. And let me clarify. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Let me clarify what you had said, because it could be confusing for the audience. I'm vice chair of an Indian business group that invests very actively in renewables and electric mobility. But separately and distinctly, I'm managing trustee of a foundation that is obsessively focused with moving very large amounts of pension and sovereign wealth fund money into the green infrastructure sector. And I'll answer with different hats on, so forgive me for that. I think that Arunabha in the last panel used the word de-risking. And de-risking is absolutely critical if we want to get the cost of capital down to being what it needs to be for the scale we need. The US was not built on private equity returns, it was built on yield returns. And you talked about INVITs earlier. I think that when we think about technology and finance, we often separate them. But actually, technology enables finance. Emerging markets are unique, but they also come up with unique technologies. There was a time 10, 20 years ago when we used to bring technology from the West to our countries. Today, we're innovating. The question of affordability you raised, I'm thrilled to say that one of the companies we've invested in, a company called Sun Mobility, which is now by far the largest infrastructure company in India using battery swapping technology, through that technology of battery swapping, has created a customer proposition that is not just cheaper TCO against ICE, but much cheaper up front. We're 20 to 30% cheaper at the shop front. And that changes everything. And when that changes everything, suddenly you have this massive ramp up. And the four main challenges to EV adoption, of course, are charge time and range anxiety and infrastructure. But through this new approach innovated in India, we're now taking it to Africa and Latin America, Southeast Asia. I'm not going to go on too much about it. If we have time later, we could talk about it. But what it does is means it's not about the economics anymore. You do not need blended finance for this. It's pure raw capitalism. What you do need, however, is innovation in financial markets. So, for example, at the moment you have corporate financing available in this new asset class. What you need is asset class financing, as you do with vehicles, for battery swapping stations, for example, which is non-recourse on a corporate finance basis. I'll talk maybe later about buses and large-scale pension capital and de-risking for the transport sector more generally.
Let's return to planning, because there's a big planning exercise here. How can, in your experience, when you've seen what looks like best in class, albeit that the e-charging sector is kind of still an evolving one, what's the best role for the private sector in thinking about, you know, and actually engaging and trying to make this transition as sort of efficient for capital, as well as, you know, a positive experience for both citizens and, you know, and politically viable for governments?
I mean, I think transport is one of those sectors where there's a real blend between public sector investment and private sector investment. And when we talk about sustainable transport, I think we have to talk more than just EV, which is, you know, an important component of it. But I think what we must talk about is sort of seamless mobility in cities. I mean, there's obviously aviation. We need to be more sustainable aviation. We need to be more sustainable rail, train. But let's talk about integrated mobility solutions in cities itself. So for example, in India, the NCRTC, which is the Transport Corporation of the New Delhi capital region, is planning rapid rail systems that's connecting cities around Delhi into Delhi. Many cities are building metros. We're looking at electrification. But all of this, what it does is it supports sort of commuters. Whereas in cities, there's so many people taking transport for so many different reasons. And how do you begin to understand where you need to invest? I mean, it's quite easy to narrow down the transport sector into sort of even narrower sectors and begin to invest in it. I'll say one thing. So, for example, talking about technology, we've been working on something called the City Modeling Lab, which takes agent-based modeling to try and understand transport behavior in cities. So particularly after COVID, things have completely changed. How people move around a city has completely changed. So if you look, we can build a model of the city, and often we can partner with cities or sites or even countries in order to look at this, to begin to identify where the issues are, what are the patterns, how are people moving through the city, and thereby use it as a decision tool to invest. I mean, where do you actually invest? Is it in public transport? Is it some? Now, it's interesting. So, for example, in European or American cities, the big challenge is to get people off private cars, because it's not just petrol, it's also congestion, into non-motorized and public transport. So in a city like Detroit, 92% are using private cars. In Delhi, it's already just 20%. In Mumbai, it's 15%. Probably Hong Kong is the only other city which is 10%. London is 30%, which uses private cars. So in India, the narrative isn't really about getting people off their personal cars. It's more about providing high-quality, seamless transport journeys for the 85% of the people who are actually doing that. So in some ways, sustainability and equity must come hand in hand when we are talking about transport. So who invests in that 85% of modes that most people are taking? So I just stop there. I'm stopping at the planning bit. I mean, one other thing I would say, I did say that transport is a fundamental driver of economic development in cities, and we've seen that all over the world. So one place where the private sector does come in is in transport-oriented development. And we've, we get lots of delegations from India, for example, and we take them out to see King's Cross and the Olympic Park and many such good examples where it's totally not car-based. They're built on transport networks, but it's the quality of life, it's the mix of land uses, which raises land values, and it is a really good economic proposition. So I would say part of that transport story and the private sector investment must be about development in transport nodes as well.
Uday, one of those key sort of mass transport options are buses. Not just in India but around the world. It'd be great if you could say a bit more, about what you're seeing, around the place and how the sector's developing.
Outside China, India is the largest electrification of bus program on the planet today. My data is a couple of years old. Europe had 6,500 electric buses. India's announced this rolling program of 50,000 electric buses. And the analogy to think about how to make this happen is indeed the power sector. Because even though we've got, as the last panel said, a huge journey ahead, actually India's been relatively successful with her power program. And how was it done? Through power purchase agreements, thinking about creditworthiness, delayed payment mechanisms, termination provisions, regulatory authorities, and so forth. It is the same analog for municipal buses. I won't talk about private buses, intercity buses are different. Same analog. So we've coined the phrase mobility purchase agreements, which is the child of a power purchase agreement and a transportation PSC. And a mobility purchase agreement also needs to be put in place in a contractually robust way with strong recourse. And CSL, just like SECI did in its time, has done a great job in getting us, I'd say, 2/3 of the way there. And it's done so dialogically in a way we passionately believe, bringing investors alongside operators, OEMs, and others to talk about the risks and this structural de-risking process that we've called the 3x5, but anyway, the three are investors, industry, and the government working together to de-risk. There are some things left. We need independent regulators, we need termination provisions, but we're getting there. This is an area where not only does domestic finance help, but what was happening in Paris over the last 2 or 3 days, some colleagues were there, concessional finance from the north can also help. We've got a $150 million delayed payment mechanism that's been put in place by the US, for example. So we're getting there. And I'm very confident we will be able to show that emerging markets like India can innovate not just technology, as I argued earlier, but also roadmaps, excuse the pun, for other emerging markets. And learning from each other. Colombia, Chile have been great examples of this as well. But it's all about de-risking. It's all about very integrated de-risking, thinking through each stage, working with everyone to do that.
Ankush, away from the wholesale financing, to return a bit to some of that retail financing for products, what would you like to see sort of in the market that might not be there at the moment?
So I think especially from an electric mobility point of view, finance needs to be rethought and reimagined. How it's been traditionally done is in a very linear manner of taking an asset, hypothecating it, delivering the finance for that. But as we are thinking of electric mobility, we discussed this just now about swappable batteries. Now the financing, the correct product for financing for that could be very different to what's traditionally been used. Can you do a leasing service? Can you do a subscription package? Now, we do believe some of these new affordable financing schemes will pick up as electrification starts picking up globally. And it's going to be similar for 2, 3, 4-wheelers across the world. I also believe that financing needs to be thought with respect to, is it a commercial use case versus a personal retail use case? Because those two are very independent use cases, and financially, the TCO is very different for both of those purposes. For one particular segment, a battery as a service makes a lot more sense, versus for one, a pure transactional loan makes a lot more sense. And I think that's on the lending and financing part of it. Now, there's another vertical which I'm very passionate about, is insurance, warranties, etc. And that itself needs to be completely thought from a grounds-up, first principles point of view from an electric vehicle. Because today, as the technology is still nascent, as it's coming up, people have an anxiety around battery technology, if the range anxiety, etc., etc. And customer-first financial products is going to help alleviate that and, in fact, aggressively transition to a higher EV penetration.
And is that partly addressing the sort of, there's the range anxiety in use, but is it partly the terminal value of the sort of battery as well, yeah. You know, and typically associated with vehicle as well, and how you kind of, is it room for commercial, for concessional finance, do you think, to kind of help sort of underpin, at least until there's a greater data set available, that sort of financial risk?
Yeah, let me just build up on what my fellow esteemed panelists have talked about, concessionality and the, let's say, cost of capital. You know, when I talk to the lenders in India or even banks, I think for them, ECB, external commercial borrowing, is sometimes not even attractive, to be honest, because the cost of financing, including the hedging, is just pretty high from what they can, you know, get domestically. To give you specific data points, I would say around, when I speak to some of these guys, they say like anything around 10.5%, 11% of, you know, cost of capital is just too high anyway. So if the role for us and, you know, other sort of de-risking players out there is not just on sort of credit enhancement, like, you know, guarantees and others, but also is there a way to tackle the FX risk and reduce the overall cost of capital to a level, you know, where it allows for ECB to happen, you know, and that's where a lot of foreign institutional capital can then flow in. So we are kind of exploring where, what is the opportunity set around that, you know, cost, enabling cheaper cost of capital in those markets in India as well as in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, thank you. If you had to pick, members of the panel, the thing that most excites you and that most frustrates you about the possible development of sustainable, the rollout of sustainable transport, e-mobility in India, I'd like to invite each of you to tell us what that is, what excites you most, and what sort of concerns or frustrates you most about the sector. And would anyone like to go first, or shall I just pick? Let's start at the end then.
Okay, so what excites me the most is, as an OEM, two things. One is you're going to see completely refreshed, rethought products in the market for all different use cases, be it personal, be it ride sharing, be it commercial. This is a chance for us to reimagine a two-wheeler, reimagine a car. If you have to build it for today's context, how would you do it? That's all I can say on that particular point, but there is a lot of rethinking, reimagining that we are doing as an OEM on how would an automotive of the future look like. That's one. Another thing which excites me is energy. Energy is going to define mobility by default, and we are investing heavily in different form factors of energy. There's obviously the here and now of NMC, LFP. We're also thinking about sodium ion, etc., for the future. So those two things fundamentally, I believe, is what's going to define mobility in the future, and that's what excites me the most. Frustrates me or concerns me, I've not thought about it. Everything is an opportunity.
You heard that there first. Just queue up. There's nothing, no obstacles. He's just going to put your capital to work in more and more exciting ways.
I think the last panel addressed this is the speed of execution.
Yeah.
I think we are here at a generational opportunity for all of us, right? And we need to. It's a tectonic shift in how consumers and businesses are going to look at this market going forward. So the speed of execution is critical. Talent is going to be critical. And having the right products in the market is going to be equally important. So that's, we have to keep a view of that, but it's a very exciting place to be in today.
Very good. Soumya.
So I think transport is probably one of the most fast-changing sectors in our cities. So the opportunity for innovation in pretty much everything from micromobility to electrification to mobility hubs to, it's absolutely incredible. And so it's never a dull moment. What frustrates me very much, particularly in the Indian context, is that we forget that pedestrians are also part of the people who move through the network. And I think it's not necessarily, the pedestrian network is not necessarily a place that attracts private capital, but I wish we had better planning and better enforcement for better pedestrian quality in our cities.
Thank you. Ute.
As you all know, we have 7 years, 10 years to make a real difference to climate change. What excites me is the fact that having created what we believe to be the lowest cost transportation solutions on the planet, we can scale the hell up in terms of particularly micromobility, but hopefully in other sectors as well. And really, I can feel it. I can see the demand. I can see the growth. And it's huge. As you said, it's 20 million a year. To give you an example, in this country, it's 150,000 motorbikes a year. So just to give you the scale of what that huge growth opportunity is, it's unbelievable. Frustrates me is that the core of the system, which is how we put green electrons into all of this stuff and how we integrate the grid, so it is the intelligent grid we were talking about earlier, that is slower than the consumer periphery. The consumer periphery is going to go explosive. But the core of making sure that the grid and green, give one small example. In many parts of India, you can still only wheel solar electricity at 1 megawatt. So it's fine for a 1 megawatt battery swap station that we put. But for all these tiny little swap stations, we need to negotiate with city authorities to get outputs. It's complex. So we need the same kind of aggression in the center of government as the private sector provides at the periphery. And if we can do that, we could be an example for the planet in actually making a difference to climate change in this sector.
Thank you. Ashish.
Well, what excites me is twofold. One is on the technology side itself, as Sik was saying earlier, like on a number of innovations in the battery tech, which can reduce the cost further, which is one of the biggest part of the cost structure. And secondly, innovations around tackling things like localized air pollution, and all. So there's a few, tech-based solutions we are hoping that will have mass adoption. The second part is around what I call access to finance continuum, where you have all the way from philanthropic, catalytic concessional capital, and to all the way to private equity like returns. And there's enough stacking of capital available for the EV sector that could be built. So there is. I think we are reaching an inflection point where we are getting a lot of these sorted. It's not there fully, but we see as an exciting role for us to play in that, enabling that continuum. On the other side, what frustrates me a lot is the lack of coordination and collaboration, especially when I talk to, from a pure financing angle, every other, philanthropic capital provider or, private sector, everyone wants to do their own facility, their own sort of initiative, rather than just sort of making sure there's not, duplication. So if we can align further on either pooling of the catalytic capital together from a blended finance perspective, or from a private sector approach, bringing industries on standardization, across different components of EV ecosystem, that will be really needed if we have to really scale the sector to the next stage.
Thank you, Ashish. I'm going to allow myself and say that the thing I'm excited about is I think there's a massive, when you think of, as an investor into the sector, in India there's a big alignment between NDC's decarbonisation goals for the country, greater energy independence, so reducing oil imports. So that's a very strong sort of driver, and a desire to capture more of the value add in the manufacturing part of the e-mobility sector. Those are three very, very powerful self-reinforcing drivers for India. And I think my frustration is, I think a bit like you, I'm a little bit worried that the sort of the ecosystem, to get the vehicles in place, the financial vehicles, investment vehicles in place is going to be a little bit slower to catch up. But we've all in this room got a job that we can do to help with that. So at this point, I'm going to say thank you very much indeed to our panel members. I hope you found that stimulating. I enjoyed it. And we'll, if you'd like, just give them a round of applause.